Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is the podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I am very excited for today and for this week. I had two really fun but very different authors join me over the weekend to talk about their books, and so you'll get one today and one on Friday, and I hope that you enjoy them because I thought they were a lot of fun. Today I am joined all the way from England. He didn't come here. It was, that I made that seem way more impressive than it was. Denis Shaunessy is the author that I am speaking with in today's interview, and his book is called The Awful Truth About the Sushing Prize, subtitled When Idiots Fight Crime. That should tell you something. It's actually by Marco Ocram, according to the book, which you might notice is a palindrome, but it is written by Denis as Marco. And here is the description. Should I tell him about Sushing or play dumb? Sticking in my comfort zone, I played dumb. Writer Marco Ocram has a secret superpower. Whatever he writes actually happens, there and then. Hoping to win the $1 million Sushing Prize, he uses his powers to write a true crime thriller, quickly discovering a freakish murder. But Marco has a major problem. He's a total dumbass who can't see beyond his next sentence. Losing control of his plot and his characters and breaking all of the rules of fiction, Marco writes himself into every kind of trouble until only the world's most incredible ending can save his bacon. Now, if that description does not intrigue you, I don't know what to tell you. This is definitely one of the more unique books that I have read because, the author is writing it, of course, but the author is aware that he is writing it. And Denis talks about how he set out to write a book that kind of broke all of the rules of writing. And so Marco, there's not really that fourth wall, like they talk about in television or acting, but whatever it's called in writing, Marco breaks it. You're reading along like a normal book for a sentence or two, and then you realize, oh wait, Marco is actually writing this and he's telling me how he's writing it, and he's rewriting it, or he's figuring out how he's going to insert some sort of plot twist so that it's more interesting. I joked on Twitter, and I say this in the interview, that it was melting my brain. I meant that in a good way, because it's just not your typical kind of book. It's so weird to be reading it and have Marco be writing it as you're reading it. If that makes any sense. It probably makes no sense. You know what? We should probably turn to the interview with Denis because he can explain it so much better than I can. Again, the book is called The Awful Truth About the Sushing Prize. It is written by Marco Ocram or Denis Shaunessy, depending on how you want to look at it. And I do have copies of this book to give away. You definitely want to stay tuned to find out how you can enter to win a copy of this book. So stay tuned until the end of the podcast, and we'll talk about that. Let's go ahead and turn now to my interview with Denis. And actually, I do want to say something about the recording of this interview. We had a lot of not technical difficulties, but sound quality issues during the interview, and I thought it was because it was international, and I thought maybe it sounded to me when Denis was speaking that it was really jerky and bumpy when he was speaking. So I thought maybe it was on his end, and we tried various things, and then I was resigning myself to having to do a lot of editing. Turns out that it was on my end, and Denis's portions of the interview sound great. mine get a little choppy here and there. I apologize for that. I did not want to re-record my questions because there is some, dialogue that happens and it's hard to edit around that. At least it is for me. So, Dennis, I apologize to you for thinking it was you on your end, your technology and the storm that you were having. I was blaming the storm. Turns out it was, I don't even know, California spring. I really can't tell you. Enough of me. Let's turn now to the interview with Denis Shaunessy, also known as Marco Ocram. Hi, Denis. Welcome to the podcast.
Sarah, hi to you too. Can I just say I am honored to be here. This is the highlight of my literary life.
Well, I am thrilled to have you here. And we are here to talk about the book, The Awful Truth About is it Sushing?
Well, that's a very good question. I think of it as Sushing, but most people I speak to call it Sushing. And of course, it's entirely down to the reader. The author has no say in these matters, Sarah.
Okay, so The Awful Truth About the Sushing Prize. I will go with your pronunciation. Before we get to that, though, if you could start by sharing a little bit about yourself, that would be great.
Sarah, well, the last thing I want is for your listeners to think me aloof and unapproachable. So I think it's probably best if we skip over certain things about me. So we probably don't want to mention my vast intellect, my comprehensive knowledge of literary matters, my tremendous charisma, my film star good looks. I think we shouldn't mention any of those things.
But your amazing humbleness, we should definitely throw in there.
Sarah, you've got it. You've got it in one. That's the main aspect I think we should focus on today. So by background, I'm one of 8 kids. I grew up in a working class outskirt of Liverpool in the sort of northwest of the UK. My background is utterly unremarkable, I would say. I've always wanted to write. I write in the way that people might scratch an itch. It's a compulsive thing for me. And I am also, by nature, I would say, instinctively iconoclastic. And I think that might show itself in some of my writing.
Okay. Thank you for that. Now, this is an interesting interview because The Awful Truth About the Sushing Prize, the author listed is Marco Ocram, which is a palindrome. Talk about writing as Marco or how that works.
Okay. So the way the book came about, Sarah, is that I'd always wanted to write something that was different. I'd seen so much and I'd read so much advice on the internet and elsewhere about how to write books. And all of that advice seemed to me to be encouraging people to write in the same kind of way. And the iconoclast in me wanted to do something utterly different. So I had a stab at writing a book that deliberately broke all the rules. I set out to write a book that was the world's most awful book, if you like. And I invented this character called Marco Ocram, and I wrote as Marco Ocram, who was this incompetent author. And the premise was that Marco had been coached by this Svengali figure called Herbert Quarry to write the first thing that came into his head. So Herbert wanted Marco to write in the way that Jackson Pollock painted, to write instinctively, never to plan ahead. Whatever came into his head next was what he had to write. And that's the way in which I created the book. And I have to say that the first example of Marco's writing that I produced was so genuinely awful that I personally found it funny, but I thought that the world wouldn't be ready for it. There was a danger, too much of a danger, that people might think it was accidentally awful rather than deliberately awful. So I've had to rein back on that quite a bit. And the work that was eventually published is quite a toned down version of Marco's natural style, if I might call it that.
We're going to take our first break of the podcast. There is your very brief introduction to the world of Marco, and a crazy world it is. We're going to be talking more about that world and how Marco creates it as he writes when we come back. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. We are speaking about the awful truth about the Sushing Prize. Let's go ahead and get back to that interview. Marco is an interesting character in that not only does he write, and as the story is progressing, he is writing it and kind of causing things to happen. If things get a little slow, he just inserts, hey, there's a clue. But he's also interesting in that he has produced or written a book on a scientific treatise, maybe? I don't know. He is very famous. He's recognized everywhere he goes. I think my favorite part, one of my favorite parts was one line early on in the book that said, I can't remember the word, but he said, this or that, depending on whether I'm supposed to be American or British.
Yes. Well, the interesting thing about Marco is that I'm British, obviously. I write Marco as an American character. And Marco has this strange way of writing that's very difficult to explain. It's only when you read Marco's books that you kind of get into the weird, surreal logic of them. But Marco is an incompetent author, really, and he has this habit of explaining his mistakes and acknowledging his mistakes as an author rather than correcting them. So the fact that he's mixed up about whether he's meant to be writing in English American or whether he's meant to be writing in US American is typical of Marco. In fact, it was interesting that one of the early reviews about the book by someone who patently didn't get the humor included a comment that Marco seemed not to have understood the differences between British and American humor and hadn't researched it adequately enough. Where, of course, for Marco, it's a kind of a badge of courage not to have, or a badge of honor not to have researched anything. He makes everything up on the spot.
Right, which makes me happy because you get plenty of British slang. I love the word squidgy. We don't use that enough here. I learned a new one, which was poodling. You used the word poodling at some point in there. They were driving, they were poodling along. Never used that one before.
Well, Marco's an inveterate pootler. I think he pootles not only in his car, but I think he pootles mentally through the book as well, if I'm honest.
Okay. So what was your inspiration for this story in particular, The Awful Truth About the Sushing Prize? And the subtitle is great, When Idiots Fight Crime.
Well, I think I've always been interested in the idea of the articulate idiot in literature. I think some good examples of that would be, you know about Bertie Wooster in the P.G. Wodehouse books, where Bertie is very good at articulating what's going around him, but totally at a loss in terms of understanding it or being able to control it. And that seemed to me to be a characteristic that was full of comic potential. So I wanted to write about somebody like that. And indeed, I'd developed a character called Pippa Marsh initially, who was this idiotic literary agent who was a complete lunatic and got herself into all kinds of trouble. And I shelved Pippa and found myself reading a book by Joel Dicker called The Truth About the Harry Kubert Affair. And I decided to try and spoof it. And it was really that led through to the Sushing Prize ultimately. I wrote this 50,000 word prototype, I guess you would call it. It was very experimental. And when I got to the end of it, I realized that actually I'd come up with something that had a reasonable amount of promise, but was very rough and ready and maybe a little bit too avant-garde. So I toned it down a bit and came up with what was logically the sequel, the Sushing Prize. And it was only really as I moved from the prototype to the Sushing Prize that I actually put my finger on what makes Marco's writing different. And it's kind of hard to explain, but it's the interplay between the thoughts of Marco, the author, and the thoughts of Marco as his own protagonist. And the books continually weave between those two different levels. And that, for me, kind of opened up this sort of conceptual space that's not really present in what I now think of as ordinary fiction. And it's a space in which there's an unbelievable amount of room to be inventive and to create jokes and to indulge in totally gratuitous wordplay. And I think I feel really comfortable writing in that space. It's just a natural, it seems a very natural activity to me.
You've spoken already about Marco as the author, as a character. What about him and his very quirky nature do you think might resonate with readers as they're reading through this series?
Well, it's interesting. I think Marco has this approach to writing where he always writes whatever comes next into his head. He never plans ahead. He never edits anything he's written. I should say, by the way, that's not true the way I write. It takes a lot of rewrites to make it look as if Marco writes that way. But in a sense, it seems to me that poor Marco struggles with the complexity of his life. He takes on a tricky challenge, which is writing a thriller, effectively, or from his point of view, what seems to be a true crime memoir, which is like a very complicated and difficult thing to do. And he's not that clever to begin with. And Marco is continually out of his depth. He's always ruining the situations he's written himself into. Interestingly, Marco started off in life as quite a different sort of character. He started off as a sort of superior sort of character who looked down his nose at his readers and wasn't very nice. I think there were qualities he'd inherited from the prototype, and I was lucky enough to work with a mentor of my own, a guy called Jonathan Ayres, who's now a commissioning editor at one of the big publishing houses. And an important piece of advice he gave me was that people won't identify with a character in a book if that character isn't likable. And so the Marco you read today is actually, I think, quite a genial character, a character who's lost in many respects, a character who's trying to do his best, but always struggling to make things work properly.
Yeah, he is really quite a lovable doofus, if I can say that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot, Sarah, that you can learn about Marco from the very first line of the book. Would it be too much for me to quote that to you?
No, go ahead.
I'm quoting from memory, so if I get this wrong, I don't want millions of letters from listeners pointing out the mistakes. But the first sentence goes something like this. He says, I was tweeting upon hashtag postmodernism and wondering why no one else was, when Doris Day sang Que Sera Sera in the pocket of my anorak.
That was perfect.
And there are several things you can figure out from that. The fact that he's tweeting about postmodernism means that Marco is a wannabe intellectual. You know, he wants to be up there with all of the sort of intellectual figures in the literary world. And the fact that he can't figure out why no one else is tweeting about it is really a symptom that Marco doesn't understand the world. He doesn't understand social media. He doesn't understand that what people really want to do is, you know, swap pictures about their cats and so on. Nobody really is interested in things like postmodernism. So Marco's kind of lost in the world. He doesn't understand it. The fact that he has a Doris Day ringtone and he wears an anorak is typical of Marco. He has absolutely no sense of style. He doesn't realize how unfashionable he is. And of course, the fact that his Doris Day ringtone is Que Sera Sera, whatever will be, that's Marco again. It's, you know, he writes the first thing that comes into his head. He has absolutely no control over what happens in the book. He has absolutely no control over any of his characters. You know, almost page by page, chapter by chapter, whatever he writes next is a continuing source of surprise, confusion, and bewilderment to him. And in a sense, it struck me. I didn't think about this consciously at the time, Sarah, but having written like that, it struck me that Marco's approach to writing is very much a metaphor for life. Because life's not like a book that you can plot out and you can edit and erase and improve. Life happens to us all in real time, and we have to go along with the decisions we make. And so, in a sense, Marco's this kind of everyman figure who's doing his best but struggling, you know, doing his best but failing to keep on top of everything that life is throwing at him.
Well, I don't know about you, but I tweet about postmodernism on a daily basis, you know, at least 5 times before breakfast. I'm going to go tweet about it right now while we take a break. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
And we are back from that break and the postmodernism tweeting that happened. Sure. Yeah, let's go with that. No, instead, let's return to the interview with Denis. We are going to talk about an interesting character in the form of Marco's mother.
Can you talk a little bit about his Bronx mom, whom he always refers to as my Bronx mom?
So his Bronx mom's this caricature figure who I think was lifted more or less directly from the very original prototype book I wrote, which was a spoof of Joel Dicker's The Truth About the Harry Kubert Affair. And she, to some extent, is, in fact, it's quite interesting that if you read the books and you analyze them, what you'll find is that all of the incompetent lunatics are men, and all of the sort of grown-up figures are women. And it's, I guess that harks back to my childhood. You know, I was one of 8 kids. My dad died when I was very young. I don't really remember my dad. And I had 6 sisters, 4 of whom were older than me. And I was kind of brought up in a house by women. And so to me, I don't think I have a kind of sexist bone in my body, really. To me, women have always represented people older, wiser, and cleverer than me. And I suppose there's, even though Marco's Bronx Mom is this clown-like figure and very unrealistic, she represents a continual voice of authority in Marco's life. She's forever trying to pair up Marco off with any of her friends' daughters. You know, she wants Marco to settle down and have kids, and Marco's literary endeavors are of absolutely no interest to her whatsoever.
She's I just love how she's just kind of thrown in. You know, I mean, her face is picked out in gems on his bespoke watch. You know, I think her face is on the lining of his car. I mean, she's just everywhere in very random sort of ways. She's like a very, very important figure in Marco's subconscious life. But she doesn't figure prominently in the book itself. You know, she appears at certain intervals. I think most her most dramatic appearance, funnily enough, is one in which she doesn't actually say anything. There's the scene where Marco's in a garage at night, hiding from some real baddie types who might do him an enormous amount of damage if they were to find he was there. And Marco's hiding behind a rubber dinghy. And as at the extreme moment of suspense, when he's just hoping that his presence isn't going to be detected, Doris Day sings "Que Sera, Sera" again in the pocket of his anorak, and it's his Bronx mom ringing him up, you know. And I think that's typical of Marco, that his mum interferes in his life in ways that he has no control over, and always means something very important, either very good or very bad to him. There is a commercial here in the States. It's been a few months, but the mom calls the son, and he seems to be on some sort of mission as a spy or something, and she's just chatting about the squirrels and her husband and, you know, this and that, and she's like, "Where are you? It's very noisy." It's kind of how I picture.
Okay. Yes.
Marco's Bronx Mom.
That would be exactly right. Yes. Yeah. In fact, it's interesting how you picture it, because the book is deliberately vague about more or less everything. You know, I don't know if you were aware of it consciously, but the book doesn't describe anybody really. Como, who's Marco's main character, is described as a giant black policeman. You know, Como's like 7 foot tall, 400 pounds. But you only get sketchy descriptions of everything. And what I find interesting is, having spoken to readers about that, they tell me that the sketchy nature of the descriptions either forces them or encourages them to imagine a lot for themselves. And I find it interesting to ask readers questions like, what do you imagine Marco looks like? How old do you imagine him to be? Because none of that detail is supplied to you as the reader. You carry the burden of of filling in all of those descriptive gaps about the characters, about the locations, and so on. The book is very, very light on description, and yet somehow most readers feedback that they're able to form colourful, vivid mental images of what's happening, even though the book doesn't provide them with that detail.
So what kind of research did you do for the book? You know, you said earlier that
your writing is not like Marco's writing. It takes a lot of effort to make it seem as though Marco is kind of writing by the seat of his pants. But so how much research did you do? Marco just uses Wikipedia, but what about you? What kind of research did you do?
I have to confess, Sarah, that I do almost no research whatsoever. So the book is entirely made up. One of my Damascene moments as a writer was in a famous second-hand bookshop in a town called Alnwick in Northumbria, which is a county in England, where I found this book called The Best of Miles, Miles spelled Myles, by an Irish author who's best known, I guess, as Flann O'Brien. I don't know if you're familiar with the name, but he wrote a series of newspaper columns, daily newspaper columns, and I'm going back now probably 60, 70 years in the Irish Times. And this book was a collection of his best pieces. And I stood in this bookshop reading this book that I found, and I was kind of entranced by it because it introduced me to a totally new way of writing, I suppose, in that it was very inventive, it was very stylized, it was utterly made up, and it was clear that this guy, this Miles Ngopleen was the pseudonym the writer used, was totally inventing everything off the top of his head, and yet writing about it in a very serious, very earnest way. And I was really inspired by that, and I wanted Marco's writing to be like that. I wanted Marco to be writing in an earnest, serious, genuine voice about things that were utterly made up. And it really was a kind of badge of honor not to research anything, really. So everything in the book was totally made up. I found out subsequently, for example, that the book is set in a sleepy little town called Clarksville, somewhere in America. I have no idea where. And there is a sleepy little town called Clarksville in America, but I only discovered that after I'd written the book. And, Sarah, if I may say so, I wrote to the police chief, or I emailed the police chief of Clarksville to let him know that I'd written this book that figured a sleepy little town called Clarksville and had its police chief as a prominent character. And I got no reply. So if ever you're in sleepy little Clarksville, please go and call on the police department and knock on their door and ask them why Denis Shaunessy hasn't yet received a reply to his email.
Well, now I'm curious if there are more than one Clarksville in the U.S. I have no idea. I will have to Google that.
Well, there's a famous Clarksville without an E after the. I think the Monkees wrote a song called "The Last Train to Clarksville."
I was just going to bring that up.
My Clarksville has an E between the K and the S. Yes, and I think there's only one sleepy little Clarksville with that spelling.
In Georgia, okay. Well, yes, if you're ever in Clarksville, Georgia, then ask the police department why they have not responded to Dennis's email, because,
yes.
That's rude.
Tell them I'm pacing up and down. I'm very hurt,
Right.
I'm inconsolable,
right.
Sarah.
Yeah. You've probably been crying the whole time, right?
I have. My mascara has run terribly.
I'm sorry. That's terrible.
Let's give Dennis a moment to compose himself, maybe, clean up that mascara a bit. We're going to take another break. When we come back, we'll be talking about, are there elements of Dennis in this book in terms of autobiographical elements? So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts social media podcast. Time to hashtag everything. We talk about all the fun, crazy stories on social media. From Instagram to Facebook, Twitter to Tumblr, or probably even Friendster. Join us each week as we explore the quirky side of social media. It's the Golden State Media Concepts social media podcast.
It's simple, such a sad song. The one that we rely on to get us.
Welcome back to my interview with author Denis Shaunessy about his book, The Awful Truth About the Sushing Prize. Let's go ahead and get back to that interview. Autobiographical elements. How much of you would you say is in the book, if any, or in Marco?
Sarah, you've read the book. You must know that for anybody to confess to any of that being autobiographical would be, the cause of their eternal shame. But I can there are a few tiny bits. Marco is a physicist. I have like Marco, I have a PhD in theoretical physics. Mine's in quantum theory. His, or so he claims, is in to do with particle physics, but I wouldn't trust a word Marco says. The only other element in the book that I think is autobiographical is, do you remember the scene in which Marco is wearing his Tom Cruise face mask to try to elicit some information about out of a beautiful woman who's a big Tom Cruise fan? Do you remember that bit?
Mm-hmm. Have you done that?
And, I haven't worn the Tom Cruise mask to elicit information about a big international conspiracy out of a beautiful woman. No, I confess I haven't done that. I confess, Sarah, you might find this hard to believe, but that was made up. But he does have this idea of hiding from some baddies. Well, actually hiding from Tom Cruise's minders, because the embarrassment for Marco is that he's disguised as Tom Cruise, trying to wheedle this information out of this woman in a restaurant when the real Tom Cruise comes in. And so it's like a horrendously embarrassing scene. So Marco runs away and tries to hide in the toilets and accidentally goes in the ladies' toilets. And that is autobiographical, because I was once going to a job interview and I went to the toilet in a famous department store in London called John Lewis, and I accidentally went into the ladies' toilets by mistake, and a woman saw me, and I thought the best thing to do was to hide in one of the toilets, thinking it would all pass over. But in fact, she ran off and called the security guards, and I got into all kinds of trouble, and I missed my job interview. So in fact, my entire career, Sarah, might have, they talk about the butterfly effect, where a tiny little thing affects the course of the future. My entire career could have been different. I might now have been a billionaire, the president of the United States, who knows, if I hadn't accidentally gotten into the ladies' toilets in John Lewis.
Wow. Yeah, you just never know. This is the first Marco book. There is another, The Awful Truth About the Name of the Rose. Can you talk a little bit about that book?
Well, that out of the two is my favorite. I know it's difficult to have favorites when there are only two, and particularly when they're two brilliant books that are so hard to choose between. But I always loved the original Name of the Rose book by Umberto Eco. Fantastic book that I've written several times, and I always wanted to spoof it as a kind of homage to Umberto. So it was a natural for me to do an Awful Truth spoof about that book. And it's if you've read the original, Sarah, you'll know that it's set in a medieval monastery. And the way I get round that is that the medieval monastery now becomes a kind of hippie commune that's an A-list celebrity retreat run as a medieval monastery. Marco books himself in as a famous celebrity needing a detox because Como Galahad, the local chief of police, has heard that there are strange things going on there and needs someone to go in undercover. So that's the kind of premise of the book. And the reason I like it is because I think Marco's character really blossoms in the environment of the monastery. You know, Marco's way of speech, his way of writing, it really somehow resonates. And of course, Umberto Eco, he appears in the book himself. He appears as Brother Humbert of Eco, who seeks Marco's advice on writing. And Marco and Brother Humbert get into a long debate about the show versus tell, which might mean something to any writers who are listening to your podcast, maybe not so much to any readers. And the book sticks quite closely to the pattern and style of The Name of the Rose, which was famously turned into a film with Sean Connery. So naturally, Sarah, I would exhort all of your listeners to go out and buy it.
Of course. And there's a quote when you Google The Awful Truth About the Name of the Rose. It is Stan, screamed the unhinged monk. Stan has come amongst us. Stan? Cried the abbot in bewilderment. And I in bewilderment. Who is Stan? I realized my mistake and retyped the line. It is Satan, screamed the unhinged monk.
Well, that is Sarah, I think that is an absolutely classic Ockramism. So that is Marco to a T. It indicates this interplay between the voice of Marco the author and the voice of Marco the character, you know, and the scope there is for funny wordplay between those two different points of view. It is an absolute Marco classic.
I have a friend named Stan, and I think he would appreciate that line. Do you have a certain number of awful books in mind for this series, or are you just going to keep writing as long as Marco keeps talking to you?
I will keep writing. As long as I can do it freshly, and as long as I feel it's new and I'm not repeating myself too much, I'll continue doing it. I've got 2 books underway. One is The Awful Truth About the Awful Truth, the movie. And that's the basic premise there is that Tom Cruise has bought the film rights to The Awful Truth book, one of the Awful Truth books, and he's turning it into a movie. And Marco is keeping an eye on it because it's one of the terms of his contracts. And Como, who's Marco's main sidekick, has been employed by Tom Cruise to be his police procedure advisor on the movie. And there's a kind of recurrent gag in there that stems from the fact that Tom Cruise is notoriously short and Como is 7 foot tall or thereabouts. And a lot of the humor arises from the fact that Marco and his team are trying to hide that difference or make sure that Tom doesn't feel somehow slighted by the fact that Como is so much taller than him. So that's one of the books that's currently underway. The other is The Awful Truth About the Clarksville Rock Cruise, and that was based on something I spotted to do with some rock groups from the 60s who'd reformed to cruise on a liner and to play basically their old catalogue of songs to rock fans on a liner. And I turned that into an idea about this Russian billionaire who hires the world's most exclusive liner as a birthday party for all his oligarch cronies. And Marco is invited along as a kind of guest speaker, and there's all kinds of skullduggery aboard the ship. And you can imagine that, one thing that all of Marco's books have in common is they bring out of the closet every single cliche of the genre they're about. And so you can just imagine what happens on this awful truth about the cruise to the edge, giant clams and pirates and any other cliche you can think of involving films or books about boats is ruthlessly exploited in this particular work in progress I have. I also fancy, Sarah, writing the awful truth about the Clarksville Wizard School, and I'll leave it to your intelligent and perceptive listeners to figure out which author's works that will be spoofing.
Nice. I have several ideas in mind for that.
Oh, I crack myself up, apparently. Let's take another break and I'll try to collect myself. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and we'll be right back.
GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast gives you advice on everything from hair to fashion to skincare products. We'll talk about the latest trends in makeup, hairstyles, and anti-aging remedies. And we'll cover all of the newest fashion trends. If you have an interest in or questions about the beauty trends that might work best for you, the Golden State Media Concepts Beauty Tips Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Denis Shaunessy about his Awful Truth series.
The covers are great. Who designs your covers? Because there is Marco with it's the same Marco. He's just wearing jeans and a jacket in one and a monk's robe on the other.
Well, that's interesting actually, because my original concept for the covers was much more arty and intellectual. I wanted to do spoofs of famous works of art, but my publishers very wisely turned me away from that and said, no, you've got to, the covers have got to appeal to the audience. So we decided that we would, it seemed that such a cliche that thrillers would have a picture which consisted of a foregrounded figure with their back to the viewer with something going on in the distance. So we decided to send up that cliche. And so the books are all going to figure Marco in the foreground with his back to the reader, looking at something in the distance. And the something in the distance will be typically the kind of mayhem that Marco has created as a consequence of being such an incompetent author. And of course, Marco is scratching his head because he is utterly bewildered about what to do next with the plot. And the taglines really are there to remind the reader that this is all done in fun. It's none of it serious.
When you take the time to read for yourself, what do you like to read? I mean, you've mentioned The Name of the Rose. You mentioned to me prior the Cane Mutiny. What do you like to read? I'm not a genre reader. I don't pick books based on their genre. If I'm honest, Sarah, I'm one of these people who likes reading the same books repeatedly. It seems to me that the world is split into two groups of people. There are some people who
never read the same book again, who always want to read something different. And then there are some people who are quite happily read the same book. And in my case, I can find myself reading the same book within the hour, and read back over a chapter I've read and just enjoy it for the writing, really. And so for me, the plot is kind of utterly irrelevant. To me, what counts is how a book's written, the degree of wit within the writing, the care the author's taken over their choice of words and so on. I like a book to be something that I can just savor for the quality of its writing. And there's no pattern to the kind of things I like. I'd pick out a couple of, for your listeners who might be interested in some recommendations. I'll give you one. Arthur Conan Doyle, he's most known for his Sherlock Holmes books. But have you ever read the Brigadier Gerard stories?
I have not.
He wrote these 2 books of short stories about this character called Brigadier Gerard, funnily enough. And he is a French cavalryman who seems to be reminiscing about his time in the cavalry. He's obviously an old man when he's reminiscing about these stories. But I would say the stories are 10 times better than the Holmes stories, and what makes them different is they're very, very funny in a dry way. And the dry humor all stems from the fact that Brigadier Gerard is an idiot and an extremely conceited one. And he has no idea whatsoever about his own shortcomings. And he's very brave and he's very resourceful. And each of the stories describes some scrape or adventure he gets into. They're very tall stories. And he manages to survive all of them, obviously. But he is, the way in which, it's hard to imagine, actually. It's hard to compare these stories with the Sherlock Holmes stories, because they're in some respects quite serious, and Sherlock Holmes is quite a self-important sort of character, whereas the Brigadier Gerard stories are very, very funny. They send up this, he's a bit of a buffoon, a self-important, inflated buffoon, but they're beautifully, beautifully written. The stories themselves are very, very inventive, and the underlying wit and humor is, I found it really mind-blowing when I first read it.
That sounds really, really interesting. It kind of reminds me of the Pink Panther series, the movies, just, the French guy, kind of inflated self of importance, not very smart.
Yes.
So that sounds really fun. Do you have advice for aspiring authors?
It's very, 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 very difficult for me with a straight face to try and advise anybody about anything, because I am an author that deliberately tries to write books that break every single rule. So for me to then give somebody advice, to give somebody a guideline, to expect them to follow a guideline, seems to me to be ultra hypocritical. But I suppose I'd have maybe 3 very high level bits of advice. I think the first is to understand the technicalities of writing. What I mean by that is just get yourself either a book or, look on Wikipedia about grammar, punctuation, syntax. Just learn the basics. I think it's utterly, utterly unforgivable not to do that, given the effort involved is absolutely tiny. In a few hours reading, you can figure all the important things out. So that's the first piece of advice. It's like, imagine, Sarah, if you went to the cinema, okay, and you watched a movie, you'd expect a number of basic things to be right. You'd expect the shots to be in focus. You'd expect that the cameraman's thumb wouldn't protrude over the lens. You'd expect that they wouldn't accidentally cut the heads off the people they were filming. You'd expect it not to be really, really jittery and so on. So that there'd be like certain basic technical things that you would expect the movie producer to get, or movie director to get right. And I think it's the same with books. There's a certain degree of technical proficiency that you must get right in order to produce something that you can expect someone to pay for. So I think that's the first thing.
What's the second thing? Well, you're going to have to wait until we are done with this last break of the podcast to find out what that is. Yes, we are going to break on a cliffhanger. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. Before the break, Dennis was giving some advice for aspiring authors. He had just talked about the technical aspects of writing, and that was his first thing. Now we're going to move on to his next point of advice.
The second is that I learned an enormous amount by offering to be a beta reader, a free beta reader for other authors. What that taught me was how to analyze the deficiencies in books. So it's all very well looking at books saying you like it or you don't like it, but being able to understand why you liked it or why you didn't like it is not so straightforward. And being a beta reader and having to articulate your reasons for liking or not liking something is a great mental exercise in being able to analyze books, and that you can then turn that capability on your own writing, and you can figure out, what am I doing right? What am I doing wrong? What do I need to do differently? And I think my third bit of advice, which is reflects a lesson that I have only recently learned, is to hire a good publicist, because writing a great book is one thing. Getting the world to learn about it is something entirely different. And as far as I can see, the success of a book depends as much upon one's ability to draw the world's attention to it as it does upon one's ability to write in the first place. And it's an entirely different skill set. So be prepared to have to overcome that particular challenge.
I know you're active on Twitter. Do you have a website, and where else can people find you on the internet?
I do have a website. It's a tremendously under-edited and under-improved website called, if you search for theawfulauthor.com, all one word, www.theawfulauthor.com. And for some time, I wrote a blog in the character of Professor Sushing, who's the baddie in the book that you've been reading. And that blog, I suppose, figured a style of writing that I really enjoy personally, which is idiocy written in a very serious tone of voice. There's something about that resonates with my mentality. I like to see crazy things written about in a very earnest and solemn way, and that's the Professor Sushing blog is my attempt at doing that. And I can't even remember what the URL is, but I can tell your listeners that the way to find it, if they're desperate to find it, is to simply Google the term didactic gradualism. And if they were to Google that term, almost the only website they will find will be Professor Sushing's blog, Didactic Gradualism.
Wow. That is not a phrase that I had ever really thought of Googling before. So, Dennis, we have talked about a lot of different topics, and it has been a lot of fun. Is there anything, though, that we have not covered that you wanted to talk about in terms of Marco or the books or writing in general?
Not really, Sarah. It's been a huge honor. I hoped we would make this the most unusual literary podcast known to mankind. If we haven't managed to do that, then let's at least hope it's the most unusual literary podcast about Marco Ocram known to mankind. That might be a slightly easier target to hit. But I've really, really enjoyed it.
I have as well, and your writing is hilarious. It's I joked on Twitter that it was melting my brain just because there's it's not your typical book, and it definitely draws you in, and you have to kind of keep paying attention because Marco does not write like most people.
No, it's interesting. One of the very nice reviews I had, Marco's attracted some very mixed reviews, and I'm not surprised by that because my mentor, the chap I mentioned earlier, Jonathan Ayres, the best bit of advice he gave me, he says, don't write a beige book. And what he meant was, don't write something bland that everybody's going to find okay. Write something different. And so I wrote this book, and I knew when I wrote it that there was a chance that some people would be absolutely either horrified by it or just wouldn't get it at all. And so the book's received quite an interesting mix of reviews from some people who say it's the most awful thing they've ever seen in their life. But one of the nice ones was a guy who said that the book was marbled with little clever things all the way through it. And I did set myself a target when I wrote it. I said in every single paragraph, I want there either to be an explicit joke or an unexpected plot twist or a bit of wordplay or really clever turn of phrase or so on. So although Marco, the premise is that Marco's just writing this in free form, utterly off the top of the head on the basis of the first thing that comes into his head, it actually takes an enormous amount of polishing. There are some little jokes that when I read them back now, probably 9 readers out of 10 won't even notice them. But I can remember spending hours trying to exactly figure out how to get the joke to work, how to craft the words, how to get the word order right, which words to use. So there's a huge amount of polishing that goes into making it look like an idiot's written it. And I in terms of inspiration and so on, I think one of the things that springs to mind and makes me smile is, have you ever watched the Naked Gun films?
Yes.
Leslie Nielsen? Yeah.
Yes.
If you imagine Frank Drebin, he's this idiot, and those films are so slickly produced, and the plots of those films are entirely irrelevant to your enjoyment of them. And it's the same, I think, or I hope, with the Awful Truth books. They have plots. The plots are fast moving, but to be preoccupied with the plots of the books is to miss the point of them. The plots are really only there as a framework upon which to hang loads of jokes and loads of wordplay, and to play around with the reader's expectations of what literature's about.
Dennis, I have had so much fun chatting with you about your books. Thank you so much for joining me. There's an 8-hour time difference between us, so I appreciate you, taking time out of what is your evening in England and my morning on the West Coast here in California. So thank you so very much.
Sarah, it has been an absolute privilege for me to be interviewed by the world's top podcast supremo. I've enjoyed it enormously, and I'm very humbled that you have taken the trouble to read one of Marco's books, and I'm also very impressed that you've survived it without any kind of psychological counselling, or as far as I know, without having to resort to drugs or any other kind of therapy.
So I'm in therapy, but, it's okay.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Sarah.
Thank you once again to Denis for writing what is a very, very strange book, but also doing a really fun interview with me over the weekend. I hope I didn't giggle too much to make everyone annoyed with the giggling, but I just had so much fun, and he was cracking me up. So you know how I always have a slight author crush after an interview, and that's definitely the case here. Don't freak out, Denis. It doesn't mean anything. I'm not going to, move to England and stalk you. It's just you're now my imaginary book friend until the next interview when Brenda will be my imaginary book friend. It happens every time. I'm fickle that way. So thank you, Denis, for joining me. Thank you, you readers, as always. I so very much appreciate you. And as part of that appreciation, I have giveaways, as you know, and I have I have copies, of The Awful Truth About the Sushing Prize to give away. So if you are interested in reading this very strange, very funny book, all you have to do is go to GSMC Book Review, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, and comment on this post. It'll be episode 214, interview with Denis Shaunessy. And in that comment, tell me your favorite typo, like one word that changes, one letter that changes Satan to Stan, something that you've read or you have done yourself, whatever that might be. Let me know in the comments, and you will be automatically entered to win a copy of this amazingly funny book. As always, if you are a fan of this podcast, please do subscribe and give us a nice review, whether that's starred or 5 stars would be great, or written. I would greatly appreciate it. And if you go to social media to enter the giveaway, follow us there as well, and like our posts and retweet them or share them or do whatever it is that makes social media go round in the world of the internet. I greatly appreciate it. Thank you to Denis. Thank you as always to you. I hope you're having a wonderful week. Please join me again on Friday when I will be interviewing author Brenda Marie Smith about her apocalyptic thriller, If Darkness Takes Us. Again, very different from today's interview, but also a lot of fun, if that makes sense. I mean, I just said it's an apocalyptic thriller and then I said the interview's fun, but it is. So you'll have to tune in to find out why that is. Hope you're having a great week. I already said that, but I still hope you're having a great week. And I hope that week involves plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.